You're listening to the Productive Therapist Podcast, the world's greatest and most brilliant resource for busy therapists who'd rather be laying on a beach in Hawaii. Each episode is packed with simple tips and inspiring insights from the Productive Therapist team to help you grow your practice and have fun doing it. So without further ado, let's help you get more done and have more fun.
Hello and welcome back to the Productive Therapist Podcast. My name is Uriah. I'm your host, and I'm so glad that you're here listening. So I just want to say quickly, thank you for the work that you do, for being a part of the solutions, for making a difference in your community, and for all the people that you reach and help in the work that you do. You're awesome. So today I had a really interesting conversation with two amazing folks from the Working Alliance, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them, and then we'll jump into the episode. So Fran Schopick is an attorney and former therapist who helps mental health professionals navigate the tricky waters of licensing board complaints. With a background in psychiatric research and social work and time on faculty at Harvard and Mount Sinai, Fran brings a rare and powerful perspective to risk management and ethics in mental health care. Such a wealth of knowledge. And then we're also joined by Dr. Karen Pavlidis, a child psychologist with over 25 years of experience and the founder of Child and Teen Solutions in Seattle. She's passionate about evidence-based care for kids and teens, and when she's not leading her practice, she's training the next generation of psychologists at the University of Washington. Two amazing folks, and we get into an in-depth conversation all about the consent process and risk management. I hope you give this one a listen. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but it might be one of the most important topics that can help you provide better care to your clients and also protect yourself and your license. So enjoy the conversation with Fran and Karen. Hello, Fran and Karen. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Uriah.
Hi, Uriah. Thank you for having us.
So before we hit record, we were talking a little bit about travel. So I thought I might start with this question. What is a country that you would like to travel to that you have not yet been to?
I actually have a state. So
Yeah?
it's Alaska is on my list, top of my list. I want to see the Northern Lights and just the beauty that's there. That is high on my list.
Sounds amazing.
I've always wanted to go to Morocco. It seems very, the architecture and speaking French. I've spoken French since I was a kid, and I'd love to do that. But the architecture is just beautiful, and the fabric and the people that I've known from there, at least that I've known from there, have been wonderful, very hospitable.
There are so many places to visit. For some reason, as far as states go, Colorado seems really amazing with the natural beauty. I would like to visit Colorado. And then Switzerland, similarly, I think is on my short list. Yeah.
Is there a particular part of Switzerland or language there? Because they speak three, there are three languages being spoken.
Right. I know my wife is the travel planner. And so she's booked, she's planned an entire trip to Switzerland and northern Italy, and includes taking the Bernina Express through Switzerland, which apparently is just an amazing, beautiful trip. So all of it. I just want to experience all of it. Yeah.
Cool.
Definitely. Well, thanks for sharing that. So for people who are listening who have not met you or heard of the Working Alliance, it would be great if you could each share a little bit about yourselves and the work that you do.
I have a kind of unusual background for a lawyer, which is that before becoming a lawyer, I was a therapist, and I am still a social worker. And as a social worker, I was a therapist for children and adults and families and couples and sibships and teens, as well as a psychiatric researcher. And I did psychiatric research. This was on the East Coast in New York and in Boston, on people who had mood and personality disorders, such as narcissism and antisocial personality disorder and borderline, as well as psychotic disorders. So coming to law, I have this really, I think, very interesting and very useful background against which in the context of which I can understand these other legal issues. And then as a lawyer, I started out doing family law, thinking that my background in psychiatry would be helpful, but it actually, I stopped doing that after about a couple of years. And I found this niche where I work with counselors who have board complaints. So counselors meaning social workers, LMH, licensed mental health counselors, as well as LMFTs and psychologists. and other licensees for the Department of Health. So that's been amazing because I can apply the skills that I have toward that work and toward helping people understand how these things happen. And then the informed consent process has always been interesting to me, and particularly with the research, it was interesting to see how it affected whether a person stayed to finish the research and how they felt about the experience.
That's wonderful. Not always a natural progression from social worker to attorney, but you have a unique set of skills.
Right. And for good reason, because, the two skills and the two personalities are very, very different. Social workers, they sort of self-screen on the basis of being connectors and, working well together and negotiation or compromise or, for the positive end. Whereas lawyers kind of self-select for being anything from debate oriented to outright argumentative and outright adversarial, and they pride themselves on that. It's not a bad thing. And their whole background, they engaged in very aggressive sports some of the time and things. So they consider it to be just normal. And to get the training as a lawyer after having been a social worker was very challenging. It was very challenging. So, but I'm glad I got through it. I'm glad I did it. And I feel like I have a unique, skill set to offer. So
That's wonderful.
I could tell you stories.
I'm sure. How about you, Karen?
So licensed psychologist, my doctorate's in child clinical. So I work a lot with teens and families, and I was in solo practice for a couple of decades until I decided to start a group practice. The group practice is about coming up on 5 years old. And so with that, I've learned to give a lot of attention to risk management and consents, and more attention than I ever did as a solo practitioner. And I run the group practice, but I still do a lot of clinical work myself I work a lot with parents and do evaluations. And in Seattle, I'm in Seattle.
That's great. Yeah, you make a good point that when you go from solo to group, the risk management becomes even more important and
Yes.
different, and something that's very key to pay attention to. Yeah. And tell me about the Working Alliance. How did that come about?
I've always done the work, as I said, with the consent process. And I've always felt that the consent process should be something that's more than a signature. It's, a lot of people treat it as if it's a signature. A lot of counselors treat it, a lot of department heads treat it that way, and the clients treat it that way. When you think about it, a person comes to you because they have a problem and they want to get to the problem. So they want to just sign off on the paperwork. They consider the paperwork to be annoying, if nothing else. And they just want to get past it. And my feeling has always been that the paperwork is the foundation of the relationship, and it's the start of communication. And it's also modeling, letting the person know that you care about these things and that you want to inform them of how you're going to be working. So that was very much my orientation. It had been extremely successful for research, because with research, it's important not just for a person to sign up for the program, but to complete it. And it seemed that people who felt that they had had a chance to communicate from the start really did finish, and rather than quit in the middle of the research. Anyway, but Karen pointed out to me that it was actually helping her services, that the services were improved. I was always aware that it's just communicated better and that it's an ongoing process, because the everything you talk about in the consent form comes up later. And it's a great opportunity to sort of reconsent the person, like you did in the beginning of our talking. The whole way you said, "Is that okay? Does that sound good?" You were sort of reconsenting to make sure that I'm guessing, to make sure that every permutation, every ask that you were giving was entered into with consent, with knowledge and with consent. So anyway, but Karen was the one who pointed out to me how much it was helping the actual client service, and I thought that was a great thing. And so we both had very different but complementary skills, and we just sort of found that it was a really wonderful effort to put our energies into. So that's my side of it. How about you, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add that in the first 6 months of the group practice, there were a lot of bumps. And I found that the more I developed my consent forms, and really viewing the consent forms as part of a broader onboarding process, which we can talk more about if you want, that is what smoothed things out. And I realized it's not just about having someone sign, as Fran was saying, but about the team knowing what's in there and sort of being intentional and having that guide the work that we do. And I genuinely feel like, as Fran said, that clients are better served with a more intentional, deliberate consent process. And we started giving talks about this to Washington State and locally, just more about how to the consent process. That's just one part of what we do and talk about. We also give talks about, Fran has done this for years, and now we've teamed up more about navigating the stickiness of working with minors and in Washington State and navigating all of those potential landmines. So
That's excellent. So I want to ask you my first serious question, but I want to put a pin in something and hope that we get to it before the end of this conversation. I want to talk to you about consent for recording sessions and using AI. So we'll come back to that because that's a very hot topic currently. So this might sound like an obvious question for most people listening, but I think it's important to kind of establish. Like, tell me, how would you define risk management for therapists, and why is it so important?
That's a really good question. We've talked a lot about that in risk management. One of the things that I've come to feel, and that I think both of us have come to feel, is that risk management and client service are mutually inclusive. People think of risk management as covering your CYA,
Sure.
and that it's very sort of self-oriented, very protective. I actually think of it as a kind of hygiene, where the same way you need to brush your teeth every day, you can't just say, well, I brushed them yesterday, I don't have to do it today. Unfortunately, you have to keep up with that. And so taking care of that process is a form of self-care, really. And it's also a form of client care. So if you're hitting it, with the right balance and hitting that right note, there are no losers with that. It's all winners. It's a win-win situation. So the risk management isn't me against you. It's having everybody understand what the limitations are and what the boundaries have to be and what the pluses and what the risks and benefits are. And to be transparent is the main thing. There was a study once, I don't know if it was a study or if it was observational, but in the 80s, one of the psychiatrists at Harvard wrote an article about transparency and the importance of it and how it actually helps to ensure transparency and the exploration of anxiety on the part of clients, that it helps with the process as well as it's protective.
I like that perspective. Yeah. And Karen, you were talking about how the consent process was helping your client care. Can you say something about that? That's interesting.
Yeah. And just back up just a bit to expand on what Fran was saying.
Sure.
But when we were chatting a little bit into anticipation, we were talking about how, we don't want the message to be that somehow if you have people sign a really good consent form, then if something happens, you're going to be in the clear. Because that is not at all where we're coming from. But rather it's that the process helps to avoid the ruptures, because the goal is to not have anybody upset or, not to the degree that they would be motivated to escalate. And so, Fran, were you going to say something about that?
No, just that, it's important to let people know. In fact, in Washington State, well, psychologists don't always have to let people know that they can complain, but other counselors do. And it can be part of the onboarding process. So it's just really good to be clear about that stuff. And hopefully you don't want to ever have a complaint. If you can spot the mini ruptures or the possibility of a rupture, or how the client might be feeling, you can often anticipate, and hopefully you'll never have a complaint or have to face a board complaint.
Yeah. And I think attending, because clients want to feel understood and you're hearing and listening to them, and that is helpful to the therapy process and, of course, risk management. But I always feel like if we're doing our jobs well and in a way that avoids surprises, the clinical work is going to go much better. So I feel like getting back to the bumpy 6 months, because I felt like I need, just as a solo practitioner, I don't know if it was just the sheer numbers, but I just learned very quickly that we needed to over communicate. And so that there are certain key things that people needed to understand. And so whether, and if you want to go into more detail about any of these, but in families where there's been a divorce or an upcoming or in process divorce, there's a lot that needs to be explained about what families can expect in working with a therapist or a group or whoever. And the same with in Washington State, teens 13 and up can consent to their own care. So again, there's a lot because parents are not used to that. So there's a lot that we need to explain, and it is not enough to just have it in your consent. So some of the most key points we share that information at the first inquiry. We share it again when they're offered an appointment series, and then it's shared again at the intake, and it's in the consent, and it's referred back to. So it's something that there might have been a day where that felt like over communication to me. And now it's like, if I feel like I'm over communicating, I'm probably kind of approaching something that's just right. But, and it's that avoiding that surprise that just people know what to expect is everything.
Well, you'd be surprised how often you can say something and people can even say it to you, but then they don't understand how it can play out. Like, for instance, a lot of people understand that that if you learn of abuse, that a child or a vulnerable person has been abused, that you have to report it. They understand that. That is to say, cognitively, they know it. But you'd be surprised how many times you can go through that whole consent process and you explain it, and they say they understand, and you explain it, and everybody seems to understand. And then they proceed to tell you something about a child being abused. And then you say, well, I'm going to have to report it. And they say, what? Why? Why do you have to report that? It's not going on anymore. And it's those permutations, or I don't know, the emotional feeling about it that they may not have processed fully. So it is important to, Karen's calling it in a sense over communicate, but it's really not over communicating. It's just taking it from different angles and different sides.
I'm really glad that you're talking about this process in that way of repeating things, because, at Productive Therapists, we provide mental health intake coordinators. And so we handle the consent process every single day. And it's always occurred to me that the majority of people don't read these electronic forms that we put before them, and they click a button and they sign it, right? So the most important things, if you don't say them more than once, if you only put them in the form and don't even talk about it, it's not really informed consent, I don't think. Maybe legally it is, but not like relationally. So I think that's really fantastic to say it, like you said, Karen, at the beginning, basically the beginning, middle, and the end, and then as needed, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it can be done. I always felt it's great to do it conversationally, like to take the formality out of it. For instance, if you talk about something in the consent process, and then invariably something will come up in the course of therapy. And that's a great time to say, I don't know if you remember, but we actually talked about this on the first day, or, that it was in the disclosure form, but here's an example of it. And then you can sort of fill that out and help people understand what it means. I used to help people. Sometimes they would, particularly in research, they say, oh, we don't need, that's fine, I'll sign. Don't worry, I'll sign. And I would say, well, yeah, but there are things that I want to be sure, for my sake, I want to be sure that we've gone over and that you understand and that I feel comfortable. Sometimes with a therapeutic consent, I would say to people, if they said they just wanted to sign and get onto the quote real work, I would say how this is the start of the real work. This lays the foundation. And that that also, I would say a lot of people will have this question, or if I were in your position, I would want to know this, or I, as the therapist or as the researcher, I want to be sure that you're comfortable with this before we get started. And it really is about the client feeling comfortable and wanting to be sure. But even so, they may not tell you what their reservations are, and that's up to you as a skilled interviewer to anticipate those things and to go over them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can we get into a little bit of the specifics about the actual risks that we're managing with the consent process? Like, what are the worst case scenarios that we want to try to avoid?
Fran has so much experience with this, with her working with providers who've had board complaints. I can say from my end, the biggest vulnerability that I feel as a practice owner is working with divorce, because it's very easy to get caught up in the system of conflict. And so, we found it very important to first evaluate the level of conflict at the absolute outset, so that we understand whether or not we're equipped to navigate this, and whether or not the therapy that's being asked is actually the right move for the child, or if there's some other things that need to happen first. And then, but once people are being seen, I think just being really clear about who the client is, and that how payment is handled between when there's two parents who are involved, and how communication is handled. A big one is that we talk about that we have a general policy about not having side conversations with divorced parents, that all communications have to include both parents. And if there's a domestic violence situation where that can't happen, like, we have to be informed about that. And so that I could go on and on about the sticky points. So I found being so clear, for a team to be clear how we handle all of those details has immensely smoothed things out. And then also with confidentiality in teens.
I can relate to all those things as a teen and
Yeah.
family therapist, and with a group practice that does the same work.
Yes.
Absolutely, the most tricky, sticky situations have been with high conflict divorce situations, without a doubt, and minors, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So informed consent is even more important there, and the communication of all of those policies and procedures and why they are done the way that they are done can hopefully avoid some of those big speed
Yeah.
bumps, right?
Yeah, and to our original point about how it improves client care, it actually does help avoid the appearance of alliances with one parent over the
Mhm.
other. So you're working more clinically effective, and that we as providers just have that clarity to guide us, as opposed to figuring it out as we go, which can
Definitely.
get us into trouble in those situations.
I have to ask you, Fran, like, in all of your experience dealing with the board complaints,
Mhm.
what are the top 2 or 3 things that were most common subject matters from those?
Well, oddly enough, one of the things that's an issue is confidentiality. Somebody will say, you violated my confidentiality. And
Mhm.
people often, without giving examples of what that means, which is particularly difficult to respond to, but people often come to therapy expecting that everything they say to you is confidential. Everything, always, forever. And that's simply not true. A well-administered and a well-written confidentiality statement or disclosure statement will say what the limits of confidentiality are. And right away, I kind of warn people against even saying the sentence, everything you say is confidential.
Sure.
Because if you make that sentence with a period at the end of it, they're going to hang on to that, as opposed to generally what we talk about, we try to keep, is confidential, but there are many exceptions to that. And then to go into the exceptions. People often present the exceptions as if it's a closed set. Like, technically you could say that things are confidential, except if you give written authorization to disclose information. That's number one. Or number two, if you if there's a requirement, mandated reporting, such as with abuse of a child or a vulnerable person, and then if it's permitted by law, you could say that's kind of it. And then people feel like, oh, well, that's simple, just 3 things, just 3 conditions. But they don't really understand that something as common to many people as a divorce or as a custody battle could very well lead to a loss of confidentiality. it could very well lead to that. And so they don't, then when that happens, they're like, what? I mean, I just spilled my guts to you and over a year, and now you're going to hand over my notes. Are you kidding me? And so that's a big challenge. And then another one is dual roles, entering into a dual role. And I'm imagining that you see this a lot, or that you at least try to warn against it, where people, a psychologist or other provider might be doing an evaluation of some sort, and people think that you're their therapist when in fact you are supposed to report to the court. Or you might be asked to write a letter and then find out that that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable practice. That you have to be very specific about what's therapy and what's it's called forensic, or going to the court, helping the court make a decision. So those are some very common ones, I'm sorry to say. And what's also interesting is that even if documentation might not be the initial complaint, if a person has good documentation, it can save them. It can save the complaint, save them from having a successful complaint. And if they don't have documentation, it can be what the department notices and comments on and sanctions. And the absence of documentation will be the absence of the help that you could have afforded yourself. But, another thing that I wanted to say is that we're kind of in a new age of therapy, which is that people come to therapy often because they're ordered by a court, or because they think that it's going to protect them in a custody battle. Or they might come as a couple, they might come not really to save the marriage, but which is how they might present it, but it might really be more to get help in breaking off the relationship. And so it's really important for the therapist, I think, to understand what role they're playing, and if they want to play that role, as well as whether the therapy that they have to offer is what that client needs. Because therapists have a tendency to think that we're all agreed on what therapy is, and it couldn't be further from reality.
That's helpful.
So that's a really important thing. Yeah. I mean, if somebody wants to come to vent, like some people think that therapy is for venting. And there are forms of therapy where you take a bat and you sort of hit a pillow, or you can yell out whatever it is that you want to say to somebody. But pure venting, arguably, is not. It may not meet medical necessity. Let's put it that way, and it may not even meet what your idea of the therapy is that you have to offer. So you want to make sure that what you're offering is what they need, and what they need is what you're offering, and that can be an interesting process, and also an interesting to convert the process into one that can be more useful and helpful. Because if somebody's just coming to externalize, to blame the other person, then you may feel that that's not therapy. It could have therapeutic value on some level, but that's not the same as therapy.
And it's interesting. We've had this experience a number of times when people call or inquire about therapy, they don't always state their intentions, especially if it's along the lines of, I really am looking for a therapist to side with me and report to the court and help me win my custody battle.
Right.
They usually don't say that, right?
Yeah,
so
it would be nice if they would say it, because then you can address it. But
it
sometimes
certainly would be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So clarifying that and trying to get on the same page is really key. Fran, as you were giving some examples there of board complaints, I was thinking about all the times that I've read our California Association magazine called The Therapist, and in the back of the issues, they publish the disciplinary actions that therapists have been through. I don't know if they do that in Washington State. Do they publish those?
Well, there is they do publish them. I don't know if it's in a commercial magazine per se, but they are published. Yeah.
And I would always read it just for like a reality check, and also like, okay, make sure to never drive under the influence, and obviously never have a sexual relationship with clients. I knew those things, and it was honestly scary to read those, because these are people who have lost their licenses or are undergoing, disciplinary actions. Not great.
Right. And you'd be surprised how it seems like a good idea at the time, like as they describe it. And really 9 times out of 10, the person who reports this therapist is the client, is the former relationship, lover, the former lover. So if not that person, then it's often their partner or former partner. And if not that person, then the therapists of each one. When they go on to another therapist, they might say, well, why did you leave that therapy? And well, we got into a relationship and it didn't work out. What? You got into a relationship? And then people can report. And another one is abandonment. It's really important for the therapist or for the provider to be very aware of the distinction between termination and abandonment. And it's not only the actual experience of termination versus abandonment, it's how the client might feel about it. It's not only what it is, but how they might feel. So you might go through all the proper channels for terminating a relationship, but if they feel abandoned, they might bring a complaint, and you might get through it in the end, which is great, but you don't want to have to even go through a complaint. And so it can be really helpful to understand what the distinction is and how to address it effectively.
Let me ask you this question. If someone is listening to this and they've just recently started their practice, or they're thinking about starting a practice,
Yeah.
and they realize that they need some consent forms, they might be tempted to go and ask ChatGPT to write my consent forms. They might be tempted to go out and purchase some quote unquote lawyer approved or attorney approved consent forms. What do you recommend when someone is starting a practice and needs consent forms? What's the best way to go about that?
Well, this is exactly what the Working Alliance is doing. Is we have a template consent form that's written with Washington in mind, because we're both Washington licensed, but and of course in the end you do want to have a lawyer in your jurisdiction or in your state look at it. But basically it's a template that takes good practice, good standard of care into mind, and then you can have that to work with to at least have an idea of what can be written. But to understand, what the best part is really to understand why it's written that way. And so we also offer opportunities for people to ask questions and to have discussion over the consent forms themselves.
Yeah, the Working Alliance package, I would say what's unique about it is that there's a core section that meets Washington state standards. And then we have a bunch of add-ons that might be applicable more generally. And the idea was that people could kind of pick and choose, kind of like Build-A-Bear, and take the sections that fit their practice, but also each section is accompanied by an educational discussion, because we're always really clear, like, we're not telling you what you should have, like, we're not saying you have to have a no secrets policy, but here's the things that you might want to think about. Here's some examples of some wording, but this, ask yourself this and ask yourself that. So it's a very active process for the provider. And I think that's where we circle back to that provider's going to improve their clinical care by thinking through these questions. So it's definitely not something where it's like, oh, here it is.
Copy and paste.
Go ahead and
Right.
It's definitely still an active process for each provider who's looking at that.
I'm curious. It seems like all electronic health record softwares have some built-in templates. Do you have any comments on, are those generally pretty good, or should they be thoroughly reviewed and adapted, if at all?
Do you mean like Simple Practice? Like that kind
Yes.
of thing? Not to name names, for example, hypothetically.
Tell me what you really think about Simple Practice's template forms. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Like if someone is, like I said, starting a practice and they sign up for an EHR, could be any of the EHRs that are out there available. It's easy enough to just click a few buttons and then, oh, these templates look fine, I'm just going to use these. It sounds like what you're suggesting is a little bit more of a thoughtful process to review and customize, personalize the consent forms so they really work for you in your practice. Is that accurate?
We did a pretty thorough review process of what's already out there, in terms of free things, like either that's integrated with a system or available just for free. And there were some good things out there, but what they lacked was the nuance. Like I didn't see really any that addressed the nuances of working with families and teens and the issues that providers who are doing that work need to think about. And, maybe they didn't go deep enough about divorce as well. So they were definitely more generic. And I think anybody who's preparing those forms is going to want it to really be highly customized to the work that they do, so that because part of the risk management process is, like, you want to have happy customers. And so that means like you want to be clear on what you're offering, and then you want the client to be clear, or their family to be clear on what you are providing. And the earlier you can avoid a mismatch with that, the better, so they're not wasting their time and money on something that is really not what they had hoped for. And that's part of that onboarding process.
For instance, release of records is a big deal. And where then again, with the release of records, you're getting into yet another consent process, right? So, but you want to have people agree on the release of records before it ever comes to it, because you know what I mean, before it actually is an issue. So one of the commercial products might say, here's the rule. If you want to release, you have to give it in writing, or, two people have to sign off, whatever that is, whatever they say. But often it's not really that clear cut. And some of it is going to be, what is the standard of care? Or what's the best way in this particular situation? If you have a child, or if you have a couple, or what the family, what the relationship is. So one of the most important things, whatever the law says, one of the most important things is to convey it clearly, and to kind of say, well, what if this happens? Or so you understand, if whatever were to happen, we're all agreed that you want the relationship to prevail now, but that could change. And if that does change, you will have just sat here and expressed some very personal thoughts. So, for over the course of months or years. And so what can we all agree on in terms of how the release process is going to be handled? And that's an interesting process when you've got people ranging in age from under 13 to 13 who have consent, and then older than 13. Because one person might think that everything's private, having it on their Facebook page, and someone else, or putting it out on the internet, and other people think that it's not at all. I mean, that you shouldn't even talk about it when you're at home, that you should only talk about it here in the office. So it's really important to have that conversation, and as I said, to sort of press on it from different angles, and make sure that, so that you feel comfortable as a therapist. Otherwise, you could be walking into a very contentious situation and not quite realize, when it's starting, and then you end up, even if you do everything right, you can end up with everybody angry at you.
I would like to avoid that. I'm sure we all would. Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, consenting is a really very complex and nuanced process.
Mm-hmm.
It's great. I mean, it's great to think about that, and to have it, to be able to discuss it with like-minded people. Like you said, you're doing this all the time. And that's a very different response from people who just say, oh, I just get them to sign the thing. It's not that big a deal. There's also the difference between disclosure and informed consent. In Washington, it's basically, it's a situation where you need to disclose to people. It's not even, I mean, they do have to consent, and that's another part of it. But the main thing is, what are you disclosing? You have to let them know what they're getting into, or what the expectations are going to be, so that the expectations are not exclusive of each other. And so that disclosure process is very telling and very helpful.
I have to be honest, I kind of wonder to myself if there's a lot of therapists out there that are speeding through all of these steps that we're talking about. And I know I was guilty of it at times. Because back in the day, I remember when there was no electronic health record, and you were actually looking at pieces of paper together and handing them across the room. Whereas now a lot of this is done, maybe it's telehealth and it's all digital. It's easy to bypass those things. And, without really good training, clinicians can miss these important conversations, and then potentially run into some challenges down the road. Yeah.
Well, and there's a lot of pressure around it, because the person, as I said, the person has come to you because there's something in their life that they couldn't handle themselves, right? They couldn't come up with the answer. So they've come to you, and they're paying for it. And it can sometimes be embarrassing to them, or, upsetting, certainly. And here you are trying to talk about this consent form. They don't want to talk about that. So it's kind of an art as well as a skill to be able to speak to them about their questions. And then you can actually weave in their questions and concerns into the informed consent process. However, you still have to be aware of the fact that you don't want them to come in, and before you have a chance to get to informed consent, they'll drop something that now you have to report. So that's why it can be good to have, I sometimes suggest to people to have on their phone, if there's a waiting, when the person leaves a message, or even on your email and on your website, to say that to give the idea about if there's abuse of a child or a vulnerable person, that you're a mandated reporter, so that even if they walked into your office and just blurted something out right away, you could feel the ease of knowing that this information was posted and that they had notice. That's really what it's all about, is giving people notice of how you work and what they can expect.
The mandated reporting, yeah, we have that on our web, just when you make an inquiry, please be aware. And then we also have it on then there's different levels of sort of information sharing, but at every level we say we're mandated reporters or mandated, because it's not that uncommon for that to come up and people are like, what? I'm not even a client, so.
Right.
No surprises if it can be avoided. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even confidentiality. A collateral person might call on the phone and expect that what they say is confidential, which it basically is. I mean, it is confidential in the sense that you're not going to go blurting out to people that you spoke to this person, but they expect that information about the client will be their information. You know what I mean? And they don't know the distinction between being a collateral and a client. So that can be important too. It's obviously a very rich topic.
It is. It's deeper than you might think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have to make sure and ask this question before we wrap up our conversation. So a lot of therapists are exploring using AI tools to help them write their notes. Some of these tools are listening to their sessions the entire time and then taking those transcripts and then writing a progress note. And people have strong feelings one way or another about this. We're not going to necessarily talk about that. But when it comes to the consent process for, let's say, a therapist asking their client, is it okay with you if I record our session using this particular AI tool? And here's the information about what's going to happen with that recording. And here's the information about why we're doing this. And is that okay with you? What kind of things should therapists be thinking about with this sort of new territory?
I'm not going to speak to the recording because we haven't gone in that direction yet, but I did recently add something to our consent form about the use of AI because we're starting to explore using that. We do a lot of evaluations. So, and I've seen examples of informed consent. I ended up making mine more detailed, not more specific. Like I, actually talk about, well, I might use Chat GPT to help me, maybe like come up with resources or other content. But when it comes to something I'm trying to improve my writing, in the report, I use this specific program. Here's the security features, versus, and it's not used to inform AI. So I go into more detail. So, but I haven't gone into the recording. I'm interested what Fran would have to say, but I think for all of this that we do still tell people, like, if you don't let us know if you don't want us to do that. So Fran, what would you say? We haven't talked about this.
Yeah, well, in some states, there's what's called two-party consent and one-party consent. One-party consent is where only one person has to know that something's being recorded. So if I'm talking to you on the phone or anything electronic on Zoom, as we are here, if I know that I'm recording it, you don't need to be legal. I don't have to tell you. It's only I who needs to know. Which to me, I mean, whenever I consider any issue. And I think whenever anybody does consider any issue in this area, they should be thinking of the legal, certainly, which is a whole range of factors, but the legal and the clinical, and then the ethical and the legal, and then just sort of common sense risk management. So there are really four planes on which you're balancing. But one party consent, in my mind, would not be informed consent for the other person at all. And it just is asking for trouble. In Washington state, you have to have, if something is recorded, you have to have it on the recording that the person has consented. So at the beginning of the recording, you'd have to say, I'm recording this, and they'd have to say, yeah, that's fine. I would also have it in writing, because there's nothing quite as satisfying as being able to show the Department of Health or yourself or another person, look, here it is, I wrote it out, and you sign, here's your signature and date. So that can be important. But really, just in terms of how it's going to be used or where you would go with it, or some consent as to if it's being used to give the person the ability to hear themselves, or sometimes that's really important to give a reflection of how the relationship is working, either with a third party or with the therapist or the provider themselves. But so it'll be important to have the expectations around that and whether it's going to be destroyed at a certain point. In general, I think to have these recordings, which can last, forever, basically, could be highly problematic. And you want to clarify. You also want to clarify that if you do use AI on some level, like for research, it can be very useful, but that your final decisions won't be based on it. Like, for instance, you're not going to have AI do the diagnosis, and it could be helpful, but but the machine is not diagnosing you. I am the person who's sitting with you or who sees you who will be doing the diagnosis. And then also that whatever the AI is that you're using, that it meet at least HIPAA requirements as they are now, so that you can have some kind of a BAA with the business or whoever it is that creates it. It's very complicated, and even better, of course, you never want to use the person's name ever if you put something into AI or use it as a writing tool. Just don't ever put the person's name or date of birth or any identifying information.
Yeah, there are so many new questions and challenges with all of these things. One of them being whatever platform or service that you use, if you choose to use them, you're trusting that company when they say, this is the security and encryption we have. We do not, most of them say these things, we do not store the recordings. They're deleted right after they're used. And we do not use said recordings or transcripts for training AI models. So they all say that, but how can you prove it? It's very difficult to do that. So if I'm trusting this company and then I'm asking my client to trust me and trust this company and this consent process, it's a little bit tricky. There's more layers to it than it used to be, right? Because it used to be, here's our consent forms on paper that we've both signed, and I would write handwritten notes and then put them in a folder and put them in a double locked cabinet, right? All those things. We knew exactly what was happening with the information. Now it's a little bit different, or a lot different.
Yeah, it's very, that's why the BAA, the Business Associates Agreement, can be very useful. You at least have the person's word in writing that they will observe the same safeguards, as well as destroy the information in the end, if that's part of what you've agreed on and what's reasonable. So, but yeah, it's very complicated, and there's a lot of trust there, and even a person might fulfill those criteria as they do it, but then the capabilities of the instruments might change, and so that becomes so. I mean, I would opt in the direction of not recording, but as I said, sometimes it can be very useful in clinical settings to be able to show the person. They think that they're very reasonable, and yet when they look at the recording, they see that they're just screaming at the person, or they might think, well, I'm just being passionate, I care. And you might be passionate, but this is how it comes across, and the person would understandably become very defensive. So it can be useful, but it still needs to be, you really need to be careful about that.
I was thinking about what you were talking about, Karen, with the writing of psychological reports and evaluations. Like, that's, in some ways, that's an ideal application of AI because it's so good at analyzing data and presenting it in really easy to understand formats.
Yes.
So, and I know there's new tools out there that help psychologists write reports.
Yeah, and they're kind of cool. But yeah, I do make it clear, like in our blurb, that we use it for to improve writing quality, or we do these fables, for kids, and ChatGPT is great for those, but that we don't use AI to guide any clinical decision making. It's really more just to improve the writing that we do.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for going down that rabbit hole with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned earlier that you've created a document package specifically for therapists. Can you just talk briefly about that and then tell people where to find it?
So www.theworkingalliance.com, and we have different packages for solo. They're the same basic sets, but we have versions for solo providers where the language is like me and I, and then we have versions for group practices where the language is more your provider. And then we also have a provider addendum template for group practices. And we have a discount code that I think you are going to make available for listeners. But again, the package has like a core disclosure, various add-ons, supplemental forms, like release of information. It's a pretty extensive battery, and we're always adding to it as well. So
That's wonderful. Thank you. And people should definitely go check out the workingalliance.com and download the freebie, which is 11 tips to help you avoid a board complaint and sleep better at night. That sounds essential.
Yeah. Good sleep is important. Yeah.
yeah,
It is. It is. Well, thank you both for your time and for digging into the details of the consent process and risk management. I appreciate you very much.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate you. You do a wonderful service, and feel free to call on us anytime.
thanks, Uriah.
That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and hit the subscribe button to make sure you never miss an episode. If you're looking for more personalized help, you can reach us through productivetherapist.com. Thanks so much for listening. We are Productive Therapist, and this is the podcast that helps therapists get more done and have more fun.